In ancient China, beauty wasn't just admired, it was purchased, refined, and confined. While official histories speak endlessly of female concubines, a parallel truth remained buried in silence. The empire's most beautiful boys, some as young as 8, were bought, trained, and kept for the pleasure of powerful men. These weren't servants or apprentices. They were living possessions, shaped into instruments of intimacy, conversation, and obedience. Their existence wasn't secret. It was simply unspoken. For over 2,000 years, across dynasties from Han to Ming, the male concubine was a fixture in the courts of emperors, the estates of nobles, and even the quarters of monks sworn to chastity. Known as Tongling, beautiful boys, or Nan Chong, male favorites, they occupied a space both exalted and imprisoned. They were not hidden in back rooms. They were paraded through garden halls, seated beside scholars, brought to banquets. Not for what they said, but for how they were seen. Most came from desperation. During famines, floods, or collapse, a child could be the only thing left to trade. Sons were more valuable than daughters. The market dictated that. A boy with delicate features and quiet charm could feed a family for months. And once taken, he would not return. Talent scouts, called human teeth for their sharp deals, traveled village to village with silver coins and polished contracts that parents couldn't read. They promised education, safety, silk. They didn't mention the rest. Selection was meticulous, ritualistic in its cold efficiency. Boys stood barefoot before strangers who touched their faces and hands like they were inspecting marble. Skin was examined for blemishes, teeth pried open to check for rot. Fingers studied for elegance, wrists for grace. Even their voices were tested. Some were made to sing or recite verse, judged not by meaning but by tone and rhythm. Scouts believed beauty could be predicted in bone, in the shape of the jaw, the slant of the eyes, the distance between the collarbones. Those who passed were taken immediately. No time for goodbyes. They were renamed, given soft poetic titles like Autumn Moon or Precious Orchid. Their heads were shaved, robes exchanged for silk, their past lives erased. What followed was training, rigid and brutal. Not for combat or labor, but for performance. They were taught calligraphy and music, memorized thousands of lines of classical poetry, learned the etiquette of palace behavior, the cadence of laughter, the timing of silence. They danced and sang, played guqin and pipa, learned massage, tea ceremony, even the basics of accounting, anything that could make them more valuable. Yet the most intense training wasn't physical. It was psychological. Trainers broke the boys' sense of self, teaching them that worth came only from pleasing others. Any defiance, even a glance too long, was met with punishment, starvation, beatings, humiliation. This wasn't grooming, it was conditioning. And many didn't survive it. Historical records from the Tang dynasty estimate that as many as 40% of purchased boys died during training, too weak, too sick, too human. Those who did survive emerged polished, perfect, and hollowed. They had become what their owners wanted, silent, skilled, and entirely owned. Their lives, once sold, became a performance without pause. A male concubine's day began before sunrise, not with rest or freedom, but with hours of grooming, skin powdered, eyebrows shaped, hair styled according to the master's taste. Silk robes were chosen with precision, layered to suggest elegance, but never to outshine. Even the scent they wore was dictated, subtle, clean, expensive. Unlike household servants, they had no single task. Their role was to be ready for music, for conversation, for company. Always watching, always adjusting. A wrong word or misplaced silence could mean days without food or the sting of a bamboo rod. Their rooms reflected this strange duality. lavish interiors with jade ornaments, painted screens, and lacquered furniture, but with barred windows, locked doors, and servants stationed outside to ensure they remained exactly where they belonged. Inside these decorated prisons, competition was constant and calculated. In wealthy households, several boys might be kept together, all vying for favor. Masters fueled the rivalry deliberately, offering rewards to those who pleased them most, turning attention into a currency of survival. Friendships were dangerous, trust could be fatal. Older concubines, once newcomers themselves, often became enforcers, passing on the cruelty they had endured to preserve their standing. Hazing was routine. A new boy might be denied food, made to sleep on the floor, or paraded for humiliation. This wasn't punishment, it was hierarchy. Weakness was hunted and exposed. Some boys learned quickly to navigate the cruelty with charm, others withdrew into silence, but all of them knew one truth. Affection was temporary, favor was fleeting, and everything depended on the master's whim. Daily routines bent to the rhythms of the master's moods. Mornings might be spent reciting poetry or practicing music, preparing for a private recital that might never happen. Afternoons were reserved for companionship, conversations over tea, massages, or simply waiting, motionless in silence. At social gatherings, they were displayed like ornaments, expected to entertain guests with stories, wit, or a well-timed verse, their smiles as rehearsed as their songs. Meals were both ritual and punishment. The quality and quantity of food a concubine received reflected his standing. A favored boy might be served delicacies, wine-soaked duck, lychee in syrup, warm buns filled with spiced pork, but fall from grace, and the same boy would find only rice and boiled greens, or sometimes nothing at all. Staying thin was imperative. Physical appearance meant everything. Too much weight, a blemish, a hint of aging. Any flaw risked demotion. Relationships within the household were fraught. Female concubines often viewed male counterparts with suspicion or resentment. The boys, after all, received better education, more intellectual attention, and often the deeper emotional intimacy of their shared master. Sometimes alliances formed, quiet exchanges of favors or secrets. But more often, there was distance, even open hostility. Medical care was minimal, and illness marked a boy as disposable. No master wanted a concubine who coughed through a song or limped across a hall. Injuries from punishments were hidden, treated in secrecy. Many ailments, minor at first, became fatal. A fever, an infection, a broken bone. Any of these could end a life. And when it did, there was no ceremony, no farewell. Just a silent burial, unmarked and unremembered, as if the boy had never existed. Among the few sources of solace were the fragile bonds that formed between boys who had endured together for years. These connections, hidden behind silk screens and guarded whispers, were rarely spoken of, but deeply felt. They shared bruises, stories, scraps of food, and moments of quiet laughter. They developed private codes, taps on the wall, borrowed lines from poetry, to communicate without being seen. For some, it was the only proof they were still human. Occasionally, they dreamed of escape. Not all of them, not always, but sometimes. Plans were whispered in the dark, reckless hopes pinned to half-heard rumors of sympathetic servants or masters traveling far from the city. But escape was almost impossible. The boys were constantly monitored, unfamiliar with the roads beyond the estate walls, and punished brutally if caught. Most gave up long before they ever tried. The rare exceptions who found protection did so by mastering not just the arts, but manipulation. Some boys learned to read their masters like manuscripts, when to laugh, when to listen, when to vanish. They could flatter with sincerity, weep on cue, twist stories into sympathy. These skills bought time, sometimes safety, but never freedom. By their mid-20s, most male concubines were discarded. Their youth, the very trait that had once made them valuable, became a liability. Too old, too familiar, too replaceable. Some were released into obscurity, given small stipends, and sent away. Others simply disappeared. There was no retirement, no recognition, only silence. A lifetime of service ended not with thanks, but with forgetting. The demand for male concubines wasn't limited to the imperial court. While Beijing and other palace cities had the largest concentrations, the trade extended deep into the provinces. Merchant dynasties in Jiangsu, Guangdong, and coastal ports like Guangzhou developed parallel cultures of collection and refinement. Prosperous families flaunted their concubines like art, inviting guests not just to admire jade carvings or calligraphy scrolls, but to be entertained by the boy who served the wine. In port cities, the market thrived openly. Matchmakers specialized in sourcing boys with particular traits. One master might seek a musician with a gentle voice, another a quiet reader with elegant posture. Advertisements were placed discreetly, and families willingly submitted their sons for review. It was business, no different, at least outwardly, from arranging a marriage or purchasing a skilled cook. What made the system especially insidious was its moral camouflage. Confucian scholars who preached virtue and filial piety kept male concubines without hesitation. Buddhist monks, pledged to celibacy and compassion, were known to shelter boys in secluded temples. Hypocrisy coated every surface of the tradition, but no one spoke of it aloud. Silence kept the machinery turning. Age was everything. Most boys were acquired between 8 and 16. By 25, their value diminished sharply. Unlike female concubines, who might gain influence through childbirth, male concubines had no such avenue. Their expiration was guaranteed. The only way to prolong their place was to become indispensable, emotionally, intellectually, or strategically. Otherwise, they were quietly replaced by the next perfect face. For many families, the decision to sell a son came not from cruelty, but collapse. Famine, war, or debt left little room for sentiment. When crops failed or floodwaters rose, survival reduced everything to value. And a beautiful, intelligent boy could fetch more silver than a daughter ever would. It wasn't seen as betrayal. It was seen as necessity. Some parents convinced themselves their sons were going to better lives, that they'd be fed, educated, clothed in silk. In truth, they were vanishing into a system that devoured identity. Contracts were signed with trembling hands, often by illiterate fathers, their names marked with thumbprints. These documents, written in formal bureaucratic Chinese, outlined years of service, ownership rights, and behavioral expectations. But what they concealed was far greater than what they declared. Once signed, the boy no longer belonged to his family. He belonged to the household that paid for him. Writers like Zhang Dai during the Ming dynasty described this process with chilling precision. He recounted how, during years of poor harvest, recruiters would appear in villages with coin purses and gentle smiles. They weren't soldiers. They didn't threaten. They simply waited. Parents, weak from hunger, came to them. A transaction, quiet and final. From that point forward, the boy's name was erased. He would be renamed, perhaps Fragrant River or Snow Willow, his past buried beneath a new identity. Hair shaved, clothes stripped, posture corrected. The boy who left the village would never return. And if he died during training, which many did, his body would be disposed of without word. No letter home, no grave to visit. just silence again. Training was relentless, designed not only to cultivate grace, but to erase resistance. Boys were taught to walk with measured softness, to bow with precision, to smile without joy. Every movement was rehearsed, every response shaped by correction. Days were broken into silent blocks, hours of calligraphy, followed by music practice, then memorization of poetry and etiquette drills. There was no play, no freedom, no room for childhood. The curriculum was astonishingly advanced. Many of these boys, though born into poverty, received a classical education that rivaled that of noble sons. They studied Confucian texts, mastered court language, learned the art of conversation. Some were trained in herbal medicine, massage, or the household finances of elite estates. Skills meant not for their empowerment, but their utility. Punishment was constant. If a boy hesitated while reciting a verse, his fingers were struck. If he wept for home, he was denied food. If he looked his trainer in the eyes, he might be beaten with a rod. And beneath the visible discipline lay a deeper method, psychological reshaping. They were praised only when they pleased, ignored when they failed. Slowly the concept of self dimmed, replaced by a desperate focus on external validation. Trainers were rarely cruel for cruelty's sake. They believed they were perfecting something, sculpting raw material into elegance. But the cost was devastating. Many boys simply broke under the pressure. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated illness claimed countless lives. They collapsed during rehearsals, fell silent in lessons, or failed to wake at all. Those who didn't make it were replaced, their names erased from records, their families never notified. To survive, a boy had to become more than obedient. He had to become invisible to his own pain. Life inside the household was a delicate performance, staged daily for a master whose preferences could shift without warning. Male concubines were expected to anticipate moods, soothe tempers, and offer companionship that blurred the lines between servant and ornament. Their role was not rooted in task, but in presence, beautiful, skilled, and endlessly available. Their quarters, though adorned with silk and carved wood, were carefully controlled. Windows were often barred, doors locked from the outside. Trusted household servants monitored every movement. The luxury was real, but it was also a cage, crafted to look like privilege, but structured for containment. Every object reminded the boys of what they were, possessions maintained, not men respected. Inside this ornate confinement, hierarchy was everything. Veteran concubines, hardened by years of survival, often ruled with quiet severity. They had learned how to remain indispensable, and they guarded their status jealously. New arrivals were not welcomed. They were tested, pushed, sometimes brutalized. Food was withheld, mistakes exaggerated, failures punished publicly. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a system of survival, passed down like tradition. Trust was rare. Genuine friendship, rarer still. Alliances formed only when necessary, and even then were shadowed by fear. Everyone knew how quickly favor could shift. One careless word, one poor performance, and everything could unravel. The master's disappointment was both weapon and warning. For the boys, every day became a balancing act between beauty and danger. Their silence was their shield, their performance, their only protection. And behind every graceful gesture, every flawless recital, there was a quiet desperation. To remain useful, to remain chosen, to remain. At the pinnacle of this system stood the imperial court, where male concubines could rise to unprecedented heights, or vanish without trace. Emperors had favorites whose influence rivaled that of ministers, whose every word could shift palace alliances. But such privilege was a double-edged sword. Adoration could turn to suspicion overnight, and elevation often preceded a fall. The most famous example came during the Han Dynasty in the story of Dong Xian, a 17-year-old minor official whose beauty captivated Emperor Ai. Described in the Book of Han as having skin like white jade and eyes that sparkled like the northern stars, Dong Xian quickly rose from obscurity to become the emperor's most trusted companion. Their bond was so intimate, so openly affectionate, that it birthed a phrase still known today, the passion of the cut sleeve, referring to the emperor slicing his own robe so as not to disturb Dong Xian sleeping on it. But such devotion invited scrutiny. Court officials whispered, rivals plotted. When Emperor Ai died suddenly, Dong Xian's power collapsed. He was stripped of his titles, accused of corruption, and ordered to take his own life. His story wasn't an exception. It was a pattern. The court's affection was lethal. To be chosen was to be watched. To be loved was to be endangered. Across dynasties, this cruel equilibrium held, boys raised from dust and adorned in silk, only to be discarded when their youth faded or their influence frightened. They were remembered only in fragments, in faded poems, in bureaucratic records, in euphemisms that avoided naming what they truly were. Their lives were real, their suffering was vast, and yet history buried them, not by accident, but by design.